Hello all you Nightmare nerds, and welcome to this week's episode of New Nightmare. At this point, you should know my stance. You release a high-quality found footage movie, I watch it. The medium embraces the genre subformat of mockumentary to create a unique experience of culture, faith, and horror. Welcome to New Nightmare, the medium. What's going on, all you Nightmare nerds? Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of New Nightmare, featuring a movie I'm fresh off of my first watch of, which is The Medium. I know, kind of at the beginning of the season, I put out this schedule where I had very specific episodes for very specific days, but last week we kind of went off track a little bit because I wanted to watch Terrifier because I'm going to Horror Hound in a few weeks, and there's a Terrifier panel, and I never got a chance to see it, so I jumped in and I saw something new and fresh, and it was something that kind of gave me a burst of energy because it was something I'd never seen before, and I wanted to get back into doing some more of that because it made me feel happy and energized and refreshed. And I miss watching kind of newer content. I've been doing a lot of rewatches for this season so that I can kind of talk about movies I'm already familiar with. But I like coming with a fresh approach to new movies. So I decided to cross another one off of my list this week that I've been meaning to watch for a while, called The Medium. It was produced and the story was written by the director of The Wailing, which is another really, really good film. But the first thing we need to talk about with The Medium, right off the bat, obviously, is it comes into my favorite horror subgenre, which, if you've listened to the podcast before, you know is found footage / this one's take on found footage, which is mockumentary or fake documentary. The Medium came out last year, and it released exclusively on Shudder. And if you guys haven't checked out Shudder yet, please do. I have a Shudder subscription. They're putting out all kinds of great original horror content, and The Medium is certainly reason enough to get a subscription. The Medium is really great. Host, which is another great found footage movie that was released over the pandemic. They have really, really, really cool kind of curated subsections of horror, so please check it out. But The Medium came out last year, and it focuses on this. I guess you would say it focuses on a family, but really it starts as a documentary, a fake documentary that is, about this Thai shaman named Nim. And Nim is possessed, or they call it possessed, but it's really like her body is a host for this benevolent spirit called Bayan. And right off the bat, kind of in that the first few shots were given some establishing shots of the villages that these people live in, and an introduction into like the spiritual realities of Thai culture and things like that. And so one of the things that I had written down was that we in a Western society kind of view spirits as dead souls, right? Or what's left after we die, what we hope is left after we die. And they make a very different distinction in that spirits are in everything, not just dead souls, which I thought was very interesting. They have forest spirits, different physical and natural things have embody this type of spiritual energy. That's such a different kind of take than like a Western approach to it. And I think this is really kind of salient when we get down kind of further into the plot, because we have these kind of dichotomy between like one of the characters converts to Christianity, and so we have this kind of like abandonment of their cultural identity towards more of a Western identity, and spirituality and identity are really two main themes that I think drive this story forward, that make it something really special, because I really, really, really enjoyed this movie. Not just because it is a subset of my favorite genre and I will eat up anything that is found footage, but because I think it's a very rich, textured, and cultured story wrapped up in a nice horror fake documentary package. And so we follow Nim, the shaman who is being possessed by this benevolent spirit, Bayan, who is kind of like the spirit of the village in which she lives. And we learn that her family has a history of being the host or the medium for this spirit, and that Nim was actually second in line in her family to receive Bayan, and they have this thing, it's called like an acceptance ceremony where you accept the spirit into you. And her older sister, Noi, we find out that she denied the spirit. She did not want to be part of the ceremony, did not want Bayan to possess her. So it moves down the line, so to speak, to Nim. So the documentary starts with the fake documentary, obviously, starts with this lens of like, let's approach Nim and see what it's like to be a shaman in this small Thai village. And from there, we learn culturally what goes into these practices, what Nim's everyday kind of role is. And there's a really funny thing, like she's kind of a spiritual healer, I guess you could say. And so the documentary crew asks her, like, if someone were to have cancer, what would you do? And she said, well, I would send them to a doctor. And I thought that was really funny because you could tell the filmmakers knew the audience, whether it be from Westerns, are going to be like, well, something like we call a witch doctor, because we're so not used to this type of spiritual relationship, right? And we have these kind of really bad stereotypes of like hiding animal organs and like slipping them out when you're trying to cure people and say, oh, look what I've done. And so they're playing on this kind of white belief that's not really ingrained, westernized, and kind of a reflection of colonialization, really. And so which is cool, because I think a lot of what's really interesting about the story of this film is that they had to have known that a Western audience would try to like jump into this, especially since it was going to be released like on Shudder, and a global audience, I think, views this story differently than say a Thai audience. But I think it does a really good job of kind of relating the two. So we come to learn that Noi's husband has passed away. And so Nim goes to this kind of funeral ceremony that they're having, where we learn that Noi's son also had passed away a few years before, and that apparently there's believed to be some sort of curse on that family, that all the men are kind of dying. And so it leaves just Noi and Mink, who is Noi's daughter. And it kind of, when they're introduced to Mink, the narrative kind of shifts over towards her, away from Nim. And so we're introduced to this kind of, I guess, modern Thai, woman, a woman in her early 20s, who's kind of experiencing life, I guess, differently than her parents and Nim had experienced it, right? Which I think is where we kind of get into the meat of this story, because as it progresses, we learn that Mink is being possessed by a malevolent spirit, where there's parts where Nim starts to believe that maybe she is the one that's destined to accept Bayan after next in line to receive the spirit. And so we're given these kind of mirrors of things that both generations had experienced. And there's a line where Noi talks about when she was going to become the receptor for Bayan, she started to have really bad headaches. She was sick. She was menstruating for every day for six months. And so once we kind of, and that was before Nim kind of took the mantle of it. And so once we kind of shift over towards Mink, we're starting to see this same kind of behavior and the same kind of phenomenon, where she's kind of just trying to live her life. Like, she's going out and drinking and partying and going to work late, and kind of living this, I guess what they eventually in turn perceive as a promiscuous lifestyle. But early on in the movie, one of the themes I felt like I was really picking up was this idea of identity crisis, because later on Mink ends up getting possessed by this benevolent spirit who we're not really sure who it is. And once they figure out it's not Bayan, they're starting to feel like, okay, like what's going on here? Who's possessing this girl? And it turns into a downward spiral of violence and murder. But it really comes back to, I felt, the relationship between Nim and Noi, Mink's mother, because it really felt to me at the time that identity was going to be a really like huge theme for this, and at the end it was going to come down to identity and accepting kind of one's role in their own lives. And what I think is really cool about this movie is that it took me through a lot of loops. Like, so I wrote so many notes, like you know, is this starting to become about identity? Is it about faith? Is it about you know, so the crises in faith that we experience? Like, whose story is this? Is it Nim's? Is it Mink's? Is it Noi's story? And it sends you on so many roller coasters, and I think it's all of that at once and more, which I think is interesting. Though I do think they give you a specific answer as to whose story it is. So through this possession, we end up learning, and through the documentary crew, we end up learning that that Noi did not want to accept Bayan when she was younger, and so forced the spirit, like did certain things to try to force the spirit onto Nim. And so she tried to deny her own role, her own destiny, and kind of push it onto her sister. And I think there's fears in this story where Noi is afraid that she's reaping the karmatic benefits, or karmatic repercussions, I should say, of denying her identity and trying to seek a different role in her life and forcing an identity onto Nim. And I think that's being kind of reflected in the role and the life that that Mink is having, because Mink is, you know, we're introduced to this kind of society in which we as a viewer deem archaic, right? We're not used to shamans or you know, like deities of that sort, a natural type of deity, because, you know, something I think is really important in terms of the lack of identity that these characters are experiencing is that when Noi decides to deny Bayan and convert to Christianity, it's interesting to me to watch as an American, because this is a spiritual lifestyle that we could only describe in our roots as like pagan or romantic, with its relationship to nature and the fact that all of these different spirits aren't those of the human soul, but that you know, natural things have spirits. And so that's the way that we view it. And I think that's kind of a flaw of us, the viewer, because we like to view spirituality, because of the nature of the history of our country and our upbringing, as like almost based in monotheism or Christianity, which is what Noi has accepted and pushed away from. And it feels like a true rejection of her Thai cultural beliefs and her identity, because she's denying that cultural heritage that is so deeply run in her family. And so she's kind of saying, no, I don't want that part of my identity. I want a new identity. And it's almost if she reaches out and chooses Christianity solely for the fact that it provides such a divide between her and Nim. And so you have that dichotomy of this, like, you know, denial of an identity that Nim is specifically, like, she took in her place. And so we have these crises of identity that are going on within the matriarchal figures of this family. And so while that's going on, kind of underneath of that is this identity crisis that Mink is going through, because she's going out and she's partying and she's experiencing herself in a more, I guess what you would call modern attitude or mindset through her actions. But I feel like, but I almost feel like she's suffering from the crises in which her mother and her aunt are going through, and that's why there's certain things where once the spirit kind of possesses her, and at this point in time, I'm thinking like, well, this spirit has to be like part of her identity crisis, right? And she's like, you know, she's experiencing, like, she's experimenting sexually and with her you know, partying, going out, living a different lifestyle than both her mother and her aunt, that I feel like it's almost like she's she's having an identity crisis of her own, because there's also symbols of like womanhood, like terrible transitions from childhood into womanhood that she's experiencing because of this kind of environment that she's been growing up of, this questionable environment spiritually that she's been forced to grow up in. And you have these very scary instances of menstruation where it's violent and it's just it's graphic and over the top, but I feel like that's relating to her crisis of womanhood and her crisis of identity in this kind of transition point. So me watching it, I'm like, it feels like these characters are having really strong crises of identity. And kind of as the story moves forward, it turns from crisis of identity and how these identities are related to their faiths and what kind of crisis that in turn is. I think their identities are so faith-based and oriented that it becomes one and the same. That their crises of identity and their crises of faith are what's really driving this narrative forward. And I think that's what makes it so rich and so full of subtext, and to me really fascinating as someone who is ingrained in that Christianity background because of, the country that I grew up in, one nation under God, right? We have a very Christian ideals when you grow up in America. And so for me to watch this kind of separation between someone who's denying their cultural heritage and their faith heritage in Noi and towards something that I'm familiar with, even to me, it feels like a betrayal. And I think that's really great, and that's a testament to the filmmakers and how well they're ingraining this identity, this spiritual and cultural identity into their characters, and how that's the driving point of conflict. And it's even more fascinating because as a found footage movie and as a faux documentary, I think it works really, really well to this film's advantage, because it gives, up until a certain point, I would say at the midpoint is where this really happens. It provides necessary cultural exposition and information to viewers not familiar with that. With this spiritual beliefs and culture, and so I think that's a very specific, intentional choice that these filmmakers are making to make it a documentary, a fake documentary. First off, to introduce these Thai beliefs, Thai culture, Thai folklore into the narrative and bring us, the viewer, up to speed on it. So I think that's a real strength of the first part of this movie, because it feels natural to me. It feels organic. It feels like I am watching a documentary, which if you listen to our found footage podcast, that's something that I like a grade or a scale that I give found footage or fake documentaries on is I call it a level of verisimilitude, how much you are able to make me believe that this is real. And obviously we have a suspension of disbelief. I almost think it's an opposite for a traditional narrative movie with third-person storytelling. You have a suspension of disbelief. For found footage, you have an insistence of belief. I think it works in opposite directions, because in order for me to buy this story, I need to believe that this is real, because that is the framework that you have chosen to relay this story to me. So, and I think this does a really great job of that. And I think the narrative. I read a few reviews about this, and some were critical of the reliance on the format of found footage or fake documentary storytelling, and I completely disagree. I think it's necessary and one of its strengths, because it really helps you get introduced to this culture in a streamlined way in the first half, and then the second half provides for really effective narratively driven scares. And I think that's a real testament to the filmmakers and to the director, the writer, about how well this is constructed and how it works both, I'm sure, for Thai audiences, because it was quite popular over there, but as well for American audiences and Western viewers who are viewing this through both kind of an entertainment and an informational lens, because we're getting exposure to this Thai culture and this Thai folklore. And I think that leads up right up until the midpoint, until the point where this story really, really changes, which is the first time that Nims tries to exercise, or whatever you would call it. That's the word that we would use for it. But the first time she tries to help Mink. And she does this thing where she wraps some sort of cord or twine around her head and then dips her finger in a cup of water. And up until this point, there is nothing going on in this story that leads us to believe that this could not be explained in some natural way or some mental health way. Like I think up until this point, there is a very real question of is this a story about identity, or can this be a story about mental health and these people getting the proper these people getting the proper care that they need? Up until this point, it reminded me a little bit of The Last Exorcism, because if you've ever seen The Last Exorcism, almost until the last 2 minutes of the movie, we're questioning this, like, is this real or not? And there's even a cathartic point where to me, it's like, okay, this isn't real, and this story really is about getting these people the kind of help they need. It doesn't turn out to be that way, which I think is a detriment to that movie. But to this movie, it was still a question up until the halfway point. And then there's this really amazing shot of the finger going into the water and Nims giving some sort of chanting some sort of ritual or prayer. And this like black goo of infection starts seeping out of her finger into the cup. And she starts vomiting up this black goo, and you're like, what is going on? And at that point, the story changes, and it's really, really effective because the filmmaker's goals change up until that point too, which I think is really important to understand and to kind of it helps from transition from point A to point B, because up until that point, we are still on we're learning about this culture. We're learning about this family living inside of this culture. We're still on an information pathway. And then we get to that one point and we see the evidence. We see the reality of, oh my God, this is real. And from that point on, the filmmaking changes. It becomes more found footage oriented than documentary oriented, even though I think they go really well together. I mean, they're part of the same function, right? But up until that point, it's more documentary than it is found footage, and then after that, it becomes found footage. And for me, as like I said, a person who's grown up in this kind of Christian culture my entire life, it's really cool for me to see that, because like because I think I do view it with this kind of bias where I'm like, all right, well, if this is a fake documentary and we have this dichotomy of like a Christian value and like a value of this shaman idealism and spirituality, I'm more likely or not going to buy the Christian aspect of it, even though that's not really where my spirituality lies, only because it's what I'm used to. And then it's almost like when you see that happen, you as a Western viewer are like, okay, so that's out of the ball game. We're dealing with the reality of this culture being like the real thing. And I thought it was so effective the way that it kind of happens, because you're following Noi as well. And at this point, she begins to deny her Christianity and make her identity move back towards her Thai culture and that spirituality. And so at this point, I'm kind of asking myself, like, whose story is this? Like, is this going to be Noi's story? Like, is it about is it about her redemption and her return to her cultural legacy and her history? Is it going to be hers? Is it going to be Mink's story about her overcoming this crisis of identity that's almost being transcended from her mother and her aunt? Is it going to be Nim's story? Because we always thought it was going to be Nim's story about her using her her cultural identity or spirituality, Bayan, her possession, as the medium. Is it going to be her story where she provides salvation to the other members of her family? And this gets thrown even farther out of proportion in my mind as I'm watching it, when we have the twist that Nims dies at the beginning of the third act. And I was truly shocked about that, because it felt like her story, even though at some point it transitions to Mink and it has these elements of Noi and her crisis of identity, I still felt like it was going to be Nim's story. Up until this point, we're kind of realizing that something's wrong with Mink, and finally everybody in the family's on board. So they get another priest or another medium or named Santi, and he's going to come and help do a ritual to fend off what they decide is a multitude of spirits from the history of Mink's father's family who have been wronged by them, who've been murdered by them in the past, that has provided a curse to them that this family married into. And at some point, it's also maybe, like karma or vengeance from Bayan towards Noi for not accepting her true identity and for accepting her destiny, right? So now we're on a path. Now we see the clear, like we're like, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to do this ritual, and we're going to save the day. It's going to be great. And during this time is where the scares really, I think, become part of the narrative, and they're really great. And there's a part really where they're like, all right, the filmmakers are like, all right, we are going to put, well, I should say, sorry, the filmmakers is in the fake documentary crew in the movie are like, all right, listen, we're going to put hidden cameras to see what this girl is doing at night because some weird stuff's going on. And it's so great because the second that happens, the inner me goes like, wee, because it's like found footage time. It's like they're abandoning all other facades of like a documentary filmmaking, and we're going into a found footage movie, and I get so happy. And the way that they do it is really, really, really excellent too. There's some amazing scares from this almost like Ghost Adventures type setup that they have of these fixed cameras, and the performance from the actress who portrays Mink is also great. It turns into some form of like body horror where you see her twist, do contortions. There are parts where she's hidden really well in this kind of wide shot of the room that provides these really interesting and creepy scares. And there's a lot of really great editing transitions between these fixed angles that it's at this point in time that all of the kind of, I think, prep of the first and second act kind of pay off, because this is where the scares kind of become more intense. And what's great about found footage is that you're experiencing them along with the characters. And there's this kind of scene where you're watching Mink as possessed kill a dog, which I'm not happy about. I'm not happy about Lucky's fate in this movie, because I loved Lucky and he was adorable and did not deserve the fate that he got. Spoilers, obviously, but you watch her kill this dog and then abduct her cousin, a baby cousin, right? And you're kind of watching this along with the uncle who's like at this kind of car base camp that these filmmakers have, reviewing the footage, and you get to experience these scares and this nightmare like with him as it's happening. And so when the scares kind of, once you get to it, are really, really, really effective. And I think they're effective because of the great kind of world building and reality construction that the filmmakers have made up until that point. And so the ritual's coming. We're gonna save Mink. It's like it's all gonna go great. And then, of course, it does not, and shit hits the fan. Essentially, it turns into kind of a free for all of like cannibal monks, like going around and like eating one by one the film crew, and you're watching this family fall apart, and you're watching members of the family die like one by one. And then as this is happening, it's kind of in this place where they separated Mink from the main group while they were doing this ritual, and that once kind of things go wrong, all of these monks that are at this ritual are starting to kill each other and kill members of the family, and Mink is on her way there. And so you realize there's going to be like kind of a clash. And so there's a moment where, and also Nims is dead at this point, right? So it's her friend who's kind of running the session, I should say, the ritual, I should say, and he ends up dying too once kind of the connection breaks when something goes wrong. And so it's very jarring because, like I said, up until that point, like we're pretty sure this is Nim's story, and for her to be taken out of that third act is really, 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 really jarring. And so you're kind of scrambling to be like, well, whose story is it now? And for a moment, you think it's going to be Noi's story because there's this moment where the Santi's dead, and Noi is like, all right, you know what? Something happened to me. Oh, she held possession of the spirits for a second after it left Mink, and they were going to bury it and spellbind it in this like certain pot, like ritual pot. And so after that, she claims that she can feel Bayan now. It's like she can finally feel the spirit, and then for like so. But you can tell something's up. But for a moment, you're like, maybe this is it. Like it really is. It's about her reclaiming her legacy, her identity, her cultural and her cultural and faith identity, and saving her daughter. Like that's what this is about. And it is not. She gets set on fire because nothing she did works. And one of the last things we see is this voodoo totem with the name of the family on it. So after all the massacres done, the only person left standing is possessed Mink by all of these spirits and this army of cannibal monks. And she finishes it by setting her mother on fire and purging her from her life, like completely through this pure lens of fire, or this pure tool of fire, right? And so the last thing we see as the flames are kind of going, it lights up the corner of this room, which the camera, we're viewing this through a fallen cameraman's camera. Like he's dead, but his camera's still rolling, so I appreciate the dedication to the format, right? So they're not like breaking at any point to make this a third person shot. It's all filmed through the same cameras. And when the flames come up, you see this voodoo doll, right, with the name of the family on it. And it kind of throws you through a wild loop because you think that they build it up, and at least to me, you think that the story is really about, you know, this faith identity, and that the truth is coming from this Thai culture with Bayan and the spirits. Like you think that's the truth, and that's where this entity's coming from. It's a negative result of it. And earlier we have a denial of Christianity. So you feel like it's like a dual kind of thing where you're denying Westernism and coming back towards these characters, you know, legacy roots and cultural history. And then you see that voodoo doll, and it's almost as if like that punctuation mark is like, whoa, we don't know. We have no idea what's going on here. Like this is a whole other belief system and entity that's being introduced that does not fit. And when you see that, you're like, okay, something's up and we don't know what it is. And then that's when finally the narrative fades out and the narrative returns to Nim's last interview before she died. And in it, she reveals to the documentary crew that she is unsure of her faith, and that she has never been sure that Bayan, this benevolent spirit that's entrenched in her village and her family's history, has ever existed and has ever taken control or lived inside of her like it was supposed to be, like it was the medium. And at that point, everything becomes so much more clear to you as the viewer, because it was about this failure of faith that they're experiencing this whole time that's related directly to their identities. And to me, it was such, and it slowly fades out and the credits roll with Nim off screen crying, having a breakdown because she does not believe her faith. And there's consistent failures of faith, and that when their cultural history and their identities are so entwined in this idea of faith, and when it fails, it crushes you, and it just like it does Nim. And so in that, you know, after the failure of Noi to be able to, like, is it her story, her like being able to save her children, reclaiming her identity, it was Nim's story all along, and it was about. Little did we know it was about Nim losing her faith and having a crisis of faith, a failure of faith, and how it relates to their identities and their histories. And I think that really makes a lot of other things clear too. especially with Noi. Like her whole life was a kind of a denial of faith, and even at the end, she denied her, Christianity as something that she turned to for something that she wasn't even sure was real. And at the end, when she claims to feel Bayan, for a moment you're like, okay, maybe she really does. And then when Nim tells you that she's never felt it, it becomes a different story, right? It becomes this kind of horror of existentialism and evil, and that this manifestation of what's going on with Mink is something that's truly evil and maybe can't be explained. And that to me is scarier than, like a demon spirit pagan god, like that's even like the pureness of that evil, the unexplainable. Like, where did this come from? We always assume it's some sort of spirit from Nim's realm, right? Like from that belief structure. And that's why we're turning away from conventional Christianity that Noi is doing, because we think it belongs somewhere else. And when you find out that she doesn't even believe what she's preaching, we're left with terrifying questions. And maybe that's why Nim's, if you want to take this approach, maybe that's why she killed herself, because she had no belief and she didn't know what to do with this information. If she never felt the spirit, maybe she felt desolation from Mink, from what was happening there, something unexplainable, and that truly terrified her. So to me, this story is really about the failures of faith and how they relate to your identities when they're so ingrained in your culture, in your family's histories, and what kind of crises and identities that failures of faith can give you. So some food for thought here on the Nightmare Network podcast. I'm really enjoying doing these new nightmares, and I hope you guys are too. I hope you like listening to them. I know we're getting a little bit off schedule with what we had planned for this season, but we're going to return to that next week. Next week, we're going to do an RIP Reboots with the Wrong Turn franchise. I remember watching it when I was little and kind of enjoying the ridiculous of that first one, but I hear the new one. I haven't watched it yet. I'm very excited to dig in. I hear the new one is something really different and original and unique, and I'm really excited to jump into that. So thank you guys very much. Thank you for tuning into Nightmare Network. This is Mike. We will scare you next week. Thanks for tuning in to Season 2 of Nightmare Network. Remember to like and subscribe and follow us on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for updates regarding all things terrifying. Is there a movie or TV series you want us to talk about on our podcast? DM us and let us know. Remember, here at Nightmare Network, you share your scares.